Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. Got Dusty here, aka the woke centrist, aka the great centrist, aka Dusty Cubes, aka Dustin Cubit, and yes, several pseudonyms. And I am Andrew, aka Mindgasms Replacement Theory, for the purpose of this chat. And we're going to talk about really interesting just part of this clip from a podcast I watched yesterday with the economist, conservative economist Glenn Loury, and liberal linguist John McWhorter, who are two black intellectuals who often talk about race on Glenn Loury's YouTube channel. And their kind of debate / discussion about whether the Fox News host Tucker Carlson is responsible for the recent mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, because apparently the mass shooter in his manifesto cited Tucker Carlson's rhetoric about the Great Replacement Theory, which is anti-immigration and basically used by white supremacists too. The shooter listed that as inspiration for the shootings. So yeah. So do you want to just go right into that clip there?
Yeah, for sure.
All right, cool. Go. All right. There we go. All right.
Telling black people to stand up with their shoulders back. He likes the fact that I'm saying racism is one thing, self-determination for black people is another. If we want
back a little more here,
amnesty-like attitude toward the country being a safe haven for people who are seeking a better life, and besides, we're probably largely responsible, either indirectly through climate change or directly through our support for bad governments in Central America over the years for the fact that they're coming in the first place. There's real arguments about the border. There's independent of the motives of the people making the argument. I'm sorry to go on so long, but I have to give that preamble to say, I went on Tucker Carlson because I wanted to speak to his audience. I have a message. I wanted the largest possible range of people to hear the message that I have. Tucker likes my message. He likes the fact that I'm telling black people to stand up with their shoulders back. He likes the fact that I'm saying racism is one thing, self-determination for black people is another. If we want true equality in the 21st century, we black people need to get busy raising our kids and taking care of our own business. Nobody is coming to save us, and so forth and so on. I wanted to get my message out to his audience. That did not mean by going on Tucker Carlson that I endorsed everything he says, but I think Tucker Carlson is a very effective voice for conservative ideas in the political discussion of the country. And no, I don't think, despite the Karine Jean-Pierre, this is the new press secretary. She has been heard on MSNBC for years calling Tucker Carlson a racist. I don't think he's a racist. I think he's a conservative. I don't think I was being a part of a right-wing cabal that wants to go out and kill black people by going on the show. If I thought that, I would have had nothing whatsoever to do with him. He is not.
Okay, so right there, John McWhorter is about to give a pretty good response to this, but I would say that I think he brought up two interesting points there. One is that, there's this kind of stupid idea primarily with left-wingers, I would say, of platforming someone and, you're evil because you talked with someone who has bad ideas. And so I think that's a good point that, him talking to Tucker Carlson doesn't mean that he endorses everything he says. But I think that John McWhorter basically expresses the sentiment that he kind of like, we can't know what someone is thinking in their minds exactly, but for people literally promoting the Great Replacement Theory, like conservatives like Lauren Southern, who I've seen defend this, claim that it's not some racist white supremacist theory, but it's people are also saying that who are just trying to cover up for their racism, and this idea that immigrants are coming in and taking their jobs. The John McWhorter brings up this kind of thing at one point. It's almost unavoidable to talk like that without making it sound like, oh, these terrible fucking disgusting immigrants are coming in and destroying our country and all that kind of shit. And then people talk about white genocide, which literally does not mean genocide. It means the genocide of supposed white culture, which what does that even mean anyway? So yeah, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I largely agree with the sentiment that, like, showing up on Tucker Carlson's show doesn't automatically make you a bad actor. And that's fine that he can appear on that show. I don't agree that Tucker is simply a conservative. I seriously believe he's not a conservative. He's kind of like just a anti-liberal voice. He'll basically say anything to own the Dems. Even to the point of him saying contradictory things. So
Yeah.
I really don't believe he's simply a conservative. I think his whole show is about being against the Democrats. Like, I can't think of any segments where he's talking about, like, policy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's all culture war shit. Like, listen, bro, the green M&M got their shoes changed, and now I don't want to fuck the green M&M anymore, and I don't want to have have a beer with them. What's up with that shit, man? The Democrats are destroying everything.
Yeah, it's kind of, his show is basically geared towards owning the libs. Like, that's kind of their thing. Which I don't think society, like, it's not like that. If that's the thing, then he is basically a demagogue, you know?
Yeah.
What is he doing to actually help? I don't know. Like, what kind of policies I kind of know some of the policies that he's pushing for, especially for immigration. But I think that the whole discussion around that, at least on that side of the coin, is a little disingenuous, because there's always a lot of straw manning about open borders. I don't know any Democrat, like mainstream elected Democrat, that's been advocating for open borders. Like, they always take the most extreme position and try to frame it as, oh, this is the mainstream position, but there is no mainstream open borders position. Like, Obama wasn't particularly good on immigration. So far, Biden really isn't particularly good on immigration.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, like, all of the hysteria that was drummed up about, I think it was like a migrant caravan that was, like, Tucker Carlson framed it as an invasion. Which is, it's completely fear-mongering,
Yeah, they're not, though. Like, even if you think that immigrants are coming and taking people's jobs, which I don't think that's true either. They're not even if you say, for the sake of argument, that that's true, they're not coming and attacking people. And if I understand correctly, immigrants have a lower crime rate than native people in the country, at least in the US. And apparently also too, with when immigrants do violence, it's mostly against each other. I'm not 100% sure about those facts, but it's if I understand correctly, that's the case.
Right. And even the replacement theory itself, at least the one that Tucker Carlson espouses, it just completely seems like nonsense to me. Like, who is getting replaced? Like,
Yeah.
I don't get that.
This is another thing that Glenn Loury is about to mention at some point here, that I've heard other people who support the Great Replacement theory say, which is that Democrats have been talking about this for years, that eventually white people will not be the majority. Very soon, white people will not be the majority of the country, and it will be Latino people. But that that's disingenuous, because no Democrat who's saying that is saying that this is a bad thing. And then also in terms of open borders, that reminded me of that sort of infamous time, I guess, when Marianne Williamson went on Dave Rubin's channel, like I think maybe 2015 or 2016, leading up to the 2016 election. No, wait. It was 2000. It was the leading up to the 2020 election, I think, with no. It was the 2016 election. There, Dave Rubin was telling her that, you know, all these Democrats support this mainstream position of open borders, and she said, "Well, could you name someone who said that they literally want open borders? Because I don't think anyone does that." And he couldn't name anyone. He said, "Well, they kind of sound that way."
And yeah, there's an interesting thing to talk about too when it comes to open borders. We do have a pretty open border with a particular country, at least when it comes to migration.
Canada?
Well, no. Interesting enough, it would be Cuba.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, because Cuban defectors will often come here, just show up, and we pretty much take them in. They typically don't get denied. So, talking about the Cubans, you don't see any Republicans criticizing that particular policy. And the reason why they don't criticize that policy is that Cubans typically vote to the right.
Oh, okay.
So to me, it's like completely disingenuous when they're talking about, you know, stronger borders and not letting these immigrants come in, when they're totally fine with Cuban immigrants coming in, because Cuban immigrants vote Republican.
That's a good point. Yeah. That made me think of too that you know, people have pointed out before that part of this Great Replacement theory and just anti-immigration rhetoric in general seems to center around the idea that Democrats want to bring illegals into the country in order to make them citizens, so they will vote for Democrats. But I mean, if I understand correctly, most immigrants are tend to be kind of more conservative leaning, because, you know, you have to work hard and basically it's hard to be able to get into the country, I guess, unless if you're Cuban. And I'm not sure what the difference is between Cuban immigrants and other immigrants, other than what you said there. But in terms of their political persuasion, I wonder what the difference is there. But yeah, if I understand correctly, it's not necessarily the case that immigrants who come to the U.S. tend to vote for Democrats. I don't really think that's true.
Yeah, and then also, it's interesting that, you know, we can't let these people in because they're going to vote Democrat. Oh, well, isn't this also an opportunity to persuade those immigrants to vote the other way? Like,
yeah, that's a
isn't
good
that
point.
kind of like what you're supposed to be doing?
That
Is
could
trying
that
to
could
convince
be
people to vote for your party?
that could be an argument that someone would use to say that this great replacement theory is racist, because you could say that if you don't want to if you don't want to encourage immigration so that you can have people vote for conservative politicians, is it because of the way the anti-immigrant rhetoric just sounds gross, no matter, like, almost unavoidably, as John McWhorter is about to say here? Because even if you don't intend it to be that way, it kind of sounds like you're saying, well, I don't want them to come here and displace the white people. I want the white people to be the ones who vote.
Mm-hmm. Right. I don't know, it just seems very lazy. Like, the thought processes themselves seem pretty lazy. It's like when you're supposed to try to convince people to vote for you instead of giving them, hey, all these immigrants are going to vote Democrat. And it's like, they don't know that.
Yeah.
They have no fucking clue. I'm pretty sure a lot of immigrants in Texas also, vote conservative. It's like it's to me it's not a done deal like that they seem to think it is.
Yeah, for sure. It's a huge massive assumption that immigrants are going to come into the country and they're all, or at least most of them, are going to vote for Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Or they probably won't even vote at all. Who knows if they're going to
that's a massive assumption too, that immigrants in general are going to become legal citizens. But the U.S. doesn't have open borders, so you still have to meet some standards to be able to come into the country, and then that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to become a citizen. And if you're coming in as an illegal immigrant, then you're by definition not going to be a citizen or voting either.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, let's go back into the clip here.
I don't know who you want to pick, Jared Taylor or somebody like that, an open white supremacist. Tucker is a very effective conservative. He's the Rachel Maddow of the right. He puts on a show.
See, I would agree with that. Like you said, he's kind of a demagogue.
Conservative politicians.
Yeah, like he is basically the Rachel Maddow of the right. I mean, it reminds me of we were hearing relatively recently about that court case where I think it was Fox News and MSNBC and CNN, or at least Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow specifically, testified in court that we are not news, we are entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
From Fox News and so on. Don't you see, when an event like this happens, why it's so wrong for you to stand in the way of the anti-racism movement, for you to write books like Woke Racism, such as you have done, John? Are they right?
Yeah, it's one of those things. I was driving home from the airport last weekend and heard about this on the radio. And, I'm sitting there and thinking about the individuals. Whenever anything like that happens, I think, imagine what it would have felt like to be that person who gets shot, to be one of their family members. Just what a tragedy this is, that you go to the supermarket and this happens. And the reason that it happened is because there's this white kid who hates Black people. And I'm really thinking in sorrow. And I've learned to expect this. I had stuff to do, but that night I took my little visit into Twitter. I don't spend my life on it the way a lot of people do, but I check a few times a day. And I thought, as I opened it up, I know what this is going to be. They're going to be all of these cocky messages, mostly from white men, crowing that people like you and me are deep sixed by events like this. It's this kind of, ha, you said there's no racism. Well, look, what do you think that is? And, there is a certain kind of person, and it's not a troll. Unfortunately, it's a normal person who spends their life on Twitter being mean, which, is fine. That's the nature of social media. But I must admit, it does rankle me a little bit that there are people out there with brains who think that you and I don't understand that bigotry of that kind exists, or that we're downplaying it, that, we're not as horrified by something like that as anybody else, that we can't see that, there's a real gun problem in this country in general. And I found myself thinking, not just these people are assholes. That's not constructive. It's true, but I thought the main point is how we're using this word. And language is one of these things. Linguistics is a discipline where we are trained to say you cannot change the way people talk. Language changes on its own. Do not be prescriptive. And so we just describe. But I must admit that with this particular word racism, I find myself straying a little bit from the linguist line. I think that to use racism to refer both to bigotry and to what people call institutional or systemic racism is so confusing to so many people that I almost wish I could wave a magic wand. If I could be kind of language czar, at this point, I would say we need a new term for what people are calling systemic racism, because it sounds like bigotry and systemic inequities that correlate with race are the same thing. And you can talk about it, you can do a teach-in about it, but it's so much of a stretch that I wonder if we don't wind up talking past each other more than we should. You and I are saying that systemic racism is a concept that is hazy and that its effects are exaggerated. That has nothing to do with even something as horrible as what happened in Buffalo. It doesn't mean that we don't know that there's a such thing as racism. Part of the reason people think that is because we use this word racism to cover two extremely different things.
I think that's a good point. It reminded me of when we've talked about critical race theory before, and about how critical race theorists, at least a lot of them, tend to use racism in this sort of sociological sense, and talking about systemic racism and racial inequities in the structure of the criminal justice system in terms of the drug war and stuff like that, and how that's one sort of problem with messaging in critical race theory, because then especially conservatives assume that when you say systemic racism, it implies that there's some malicious intent behind it, whereas with systemic racism specifically, there's malicious intent is not a requirement, and that's not really what people are talking about when they say it.
Yeah, there's kind of like a moral difference versus a practical difference, like what the system causes versus the intent. Like it'd be like the difference between manslaughter and, first-degree murder. Like in either way, somebody dies. One in manslaughter is not intentional. In first-degree murder, there's a premeditation there to cause it with malice. So I totally understand that. Like there's definitely a difference between the two, and there's terms to differentiate those two things. But it seems like in the case of systemic racism, that's specifically like the non-malice version of racism. And when you just say racism, or that person's racist, I don't know. Sometimes it could be a completely just ignorant person that just doesn't know, and don't have any malicious intent, or it could be like a white supremacist or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, there's different degrees, and of course, you don't treat both of those degrees the same way. 1 degree, someone's ignorant of something, you can tell them, hey, in this culture here, you can't really use these terms.
Right.
Or, and then, when you're dealing with a white supremacist or a racist, that there's definitely a malicious intent. And then there's like stuff in between, there's like light bigotry. There's definitely some bigotry. Some of it might not be extremely malicious. It could just also span from ignorance as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's definitely a spectrum. Unfortunately, like the word racism is very triggering for people. So it's almost like once they hear that word, they think it's always the worst possible scenario that's happening when that word comes up.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like you're like almost you have that malicious intent, whether you're a white supremacist or just racist in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I've just been thinking about that lately. It really is a problem, this extension of racism to something so abstract and systemic, which, as I said at the Times, if we were a different language, probably there would be a whole different word for it. And notice that we're not saying that there's no such thing as structural inequities. I'm just talking about the words that we use. And I'm just tired of it. Racism is Archie Bunker. Racism is that boy in Buffalo. Systemic inequities and what you do about them should be some other word. But it's hard to find a word because we're so used to using the word racism to refer to that too.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I'm following
I think
you.
he has a pretty good point there.
There is this
Yeah, for sure.
Ethical failing of contempt for other people, reliance on denigrating stereotypes about them, visceral dislike for association with them, a hatred of them, which you want to call racism, and you want to preserve that word and distinguish that, which is something true about the history and ongoing social reality of American society, but not perhaps as determinative of the quality of life of African Americans as was the case in years past. You want to distinguish that from environmental disproportionate impact of a site of chemical, something that happens to be near a poor community because the land is cheap. Poor community is disproportionately Black. Therefore, Blacks are disproportionately adversely affected by the environmental impact. But it's not as if somebody sat down and said, let's go after Black people and do something to them. And there's like a gazillion things that are like that. If New Orleans floods, it's the low-lying areas that are going to be flooded. If there's a pandemic that hits us, it's the vulnerable communities that are more likely to suffer the morbidity and mortality hit from the pandemic. If there's a test for who gets into the high school and some households are disadvantaged with respect to preparing their kids to take the test, et cetera, this is not the same thing as that other thing. And conflating the two of them leads to confusion and error in terms of how we respond. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but that's what I heard.
That was your usual beautiful job. And
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I like Glenn Loury, because he's really good at being charitable towards left-wing arguments.
Yeah. I certainly get what he's saying here, but I think there's probably more nuance can be approached here. As I do see he's talking about, the inequities and how to deal with them, but I think one of the things that you just might have to think about, because I know he's talking about there are historical reasons why, well, I'll say factors, because you can't entirely blame one thing as the cause of what happens. You definitely have to recognize that, okay, redlining can play a factor where people, like Black people, could have lived. Like if redlining, like that can definitely affect the future wealth of a family. If they're barred from entering a white middle class neighborhood, and this is going to have downstream effects. It's not going to be entirely the reason why a lot of these poorer communities might be more afflicted by environmental disasters. But even the one that he gave, like Katrina, and if you juxtapose that to another major storm that happened on the East Coast in New Jersey and Jersey Shore, largely because it was a rich community, they were able to completely rebuild that area, and it was not much of a hassle. I think they got a lot of government assistance with that as well. But, even right now in Katrina, there are still big parts of the neighborhoods down there that just never rebuilt. and still
Oh,
look like
okay.
a disaster zone. It's pretty sad.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that. But
Yeah,
yeah,
they
that makes
didn't
sense.
completely fix everything down there. There are definitely still neighborhoods that never got fixed.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Like Glenn Lowry was saying, if you live in a lower income area, you're more likely to experience that, and Black people in the US in particular are disproportionately more likely to be poor. So that would make sense.
Yes, exactly. There is no agency, as some sophisticated people might put it, in what you just described. There is a disproportionate impact, but the idea that that means that society is racist, that's an interesting stretch. It's something you can imagine an artist trying to get across. It's something you imagine philosophers would discuss. But the idea that that's the way we ordinary people are going to talk about these things means that you and I say solutions to the sorts of problems you just described, such as not enough Black kids in the school that requires a test. And there are going to be solutions to it. That solutions to it are not going to be about, for example, getting rid of people like that kid in Buffalo or changing hostile racist attitudes. There's a difference. Now, of course, there's going to be some sort of nexus. There's going to be some sort of bleed in that you might say, white people don't care enough about Black people to make sure this doesn't happen. Okay, but that's too much of a stretch to justify calling both of those things racism. It is not racism that keeps a certain amount of Black kids in New York City from Stuyvesant High School, not in any sense that anybody would have recognized in the way the word was used 70 years ago. And I don't think that we've advanced on that. And it also means that viscerally, you think of a racist and you think, well, that's a terrible person, like the kid in Buffalo. Then we talk about something called systemic racism, and it puts your same fist up in the air. Society is racist, and you're thinking in part about white people who don't care enough. But the thing is, the white people in question can't do anything about it. You're thinking about white people walking around at a mall. They can't fix this, and yet you're supposed to have your fist up angry at them. That's not progressive. And so I just really wish that we would just call it, race-based inequities or something like this. I've kind of scooted around on this in various things I've written over the past 5 years. I've never settled on anything, but I'm almost ready to stop saying systemic racism, institutional racism, and saying that those terms should be avoided. But there better be something really solid to replace them. So,
well, now I'm a little confused, John, because if
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I have some. I agree with John McWhorter, and probably Glenn Lowry would agree as well. I think he's right. Like, I do take kind of the Thaddeus view of this, in that Black people should not look to white people to solve their problem. I think that is because it only affirms that there is a social racial caste system. Like,
Yeah.
if you it's just like, oh yeah, society is racist. Let's go and force white people to blah 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 blah. It's like, okay, yeah, we're not. How is laying all your cards and betting them on white people to fix your problems, how is that going to help? Like, you got to be able to, like, this is a democracy. Run for office.
Yeah.
Put candidates out there. You don't have to ask white people to save you. It's like, there's no white. You need to kind of ditch that white savior complex there. So I totally agree on that point, that they definitely need to not look for white people to save them. And I do agree too, as well as, like, I think saying society is racist is a very hyperbolic thing to say. I know a lot of CRT is kind of meant to be provocative and hyperbolic. I think a more accurate statement would be racism is a component of our society.
Yeah.
And if you want to debate how big or small that component is, you can talk about that. But I think saying society is racist is just kind of, I don't know, hyperbolic and dumb to me.
Yeah, this is also like one of the differences in general, especially between critical racist theorists and anti-racists like Robin DiAngelo, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Ibram X. Kennedy, where they have that sort of, they promote that sort of white saviorism, which is sort of just patronizing to black people, that white people have to be tripping all over themselves all the time to be apologizing for racism and endlessly apologize for it, even though you can never actually atone for it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think DiAngelo is probably more guilty of that than Ibram X. Kennedy, because at least he does not like ascribe to the privilege plus power view of racism, which is anyone who ascribes to that view basically says that white people are responsible for racism.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah, that's an important point that we've talked about before. There's a difference between critical race theorists and anti-racists, and there's also a difference amongst anti-racists.
All right, like X. Kennedy and DiAngelo disagree with each other on various things, and are almost polar opposites on some of those things.
Yeah, for sure.
I recall correctly, the last time we discussed the voter ID issue and the Jim Crow 2.0, as President Biden put it, about the Georgia law and so forth and so on, you were saying that, was I correct in remembering now? Am I correct in remembering? You were saying that the Republicans were racist in promoting such laws. So
No.
Because it doesn't seem to fit your strict definition of racism that you're proposing right now.
No, actually, I've always said, and maybe that's what it sounded like then, and I seem to have, out of the corner of my eye, I've noticed a lot of negative feedback I got from that episode. And I meant that it is not necessarily racist. It's nakedly pragmatic in a way that suggests that those people don't weight race issues as heavily as many other people.
Okay.
But no, it's not racism. It's not Jim Crow. It's mean. And there's a difference, although a lot of people don't see it.
Okay. Did you hear President Biden's remarks when he went to...
Yeah, that's a good point too. There can be a subtle difference between being mean and being racist. Kind of similar to what you were mentioning before about how someone can be unintentionally racist out of ignorance, like we don't do that here in this culture, as the example you used, or they can be deliberately racist out of malicious intent.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a case of it having an effect that disproportionately affects certain races. But in the case of Republicans doing that, they're solely doing that to hold on to power in a very undemocratic way.
Yeah.
We all know, like, the lower the turnout, the more likely a Republican is to win an election.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. The more people who turn out for elections, the higher the probability that a Democrat will win. Like, turnout favors Democrats.
Oh, okay.
Which is why they want to clamp down on voting. They actually don't want that many people to vote.
Right. Oh, okay, that makes sense. That kind of makes sense for, why they would say that in their promotion of the anti-immigrant rhetoric and the great replacement theory.
Yeah, they just don't want to say the quiet part out loud, which is basically, we want to restrict voting rights because Republicans aren't that popular. That's kind of basically what they're saying. Because we do see, like, when you talk about different policies and how a majority of people side on certain policies when you do like national polls. And a lot of those policies that people tend to side for are the ones that Republicans are like, no. So it's weird thing is like a lot of Democratic or even left-wing policies are popular, but they don't go through because of these types of voting restrictions.
And a lot of people, like a lot of radical lefty activists and people like that, don't actually vote because they're black-pilled and they don't think there's a point in trying to change the system anyway.
Yeah, because you've seen like arguments on the left or like, oh, I'd rather not vote for Biden because even in the face of him running for Trump, like I'd rather have Trump win again than have like some centrist Democrat.
Yeah,
there are definitely like those types,
Yeah, especially some third party progressive supporters seem to think that way, like Jimmy Dore and a lot of other people. Although Jimmy Dore is kind of disingenuous, as we've discussed before.
Right.
To Buffalo and spoke in comforting and condolences and consolation of the families.
Yeah, I read them. Yeah.
Do you think that he and the Democrats more broadly are, how do I want to put this, exploiting the opportunity which this terrible tragedy presents to discredit their political opponents by tacitly associating them with the heinous act of the killer? There's a piece by Glenn Greenwald that he puts out at his Substack that I read. I don't know if you saw it, but he excoriates not only the politicians, but also the media for quickly going from the act of this murderous, racist nut who slaughtered those people in that market in Buffalo to the politics of the right wing of the Republican Party who are concerned about immigration. This is Tucker Carlson, who worry that, what do they call it, replacement theory, that the Democrats are trying to replace, Jews will not replace us, you will not replace us, this kind of racism. I think you would agree, this is racism. And to use this incident to draw a line between those two. I mean, Glenn, I'll stop, but I just want to get this question on the table. Are the Dems exploiting? I'm asking you. Greenwald seems to think so, and he recalls the shooting of Congressman Steve Scalise in 2017, shortly after Trump was inaugurated, by a very ardent Democrat who listened to Rachel Maddow every night and was all excited about how terrible it was that Trump was in office and Republicans were bad people. And he goes out, shoots up a bunch of guys playing on a baseball game out in the park, and within an inch of his life, in the case of Scalise, he's wounded. Some police officers were killed by this guy at the site. And Greenwald just wants to make the point. You could have said the rhetoric of the Democrats motivated the rhetoric, the anti-Trump, Trump is a traitor rhetoric of Rachel Maddow motivated this guy. But no one did say that. No one blamed Democrats for this nut. Why are you blaming Tucker Carlson, who stridently denounces the open border, quote unquote, policies as he sees it of the Democrats, and worries about the consequence of unlimited immigration across the southern border, changing the demographic composition of the country in such a way as to promote the liberals' political ambitions? They blame Tucker Carlson indirectly for this, et cetera. I'll stop. You see what I'm trying to say?
I thought it was a very clever point about the Scalise incident. And I think that what it comes down to.
What do you think about that, Dusty? I'm not sure what to think about that.
Well, I think McWhorter is going to make a really good point right now.
Yeah, he does.
Is that every time Republicans only really have this one example of it. Like every time I hear the whataboutism argument about, hey, the other side does it too. they only reference this one case. And there's another thing too. When we're talking about this great replacement theory, unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with the kind of rhetoric that Maddow espouses, and there's probably a reason. She's not as popular as Tucker Carlson.
Yeah. Well, and she's not an MSNBC host anymore.
Yeah, that as well. So, I think a lot too. If you take a look at the rhetoric, whether it's to the extreme level of the Buffalo shooter, or when it's to the level of like the Republican talking point, and either way, there is an othering that occurs here, and the othering is based off of not really a political view. It's based off of, hey, they're simply an immigrant, therefore they're bad.
Yeah.
Even though they don't know what their possible political affiliation is, they're also othering by saying, hey, they're going to replace us.
It's also it's kind of hypocritical too, because especially conservatives are supposed to be all about the individual, but you're not considering this individual immigrant's political views. You're just assuming they're going to be lefties.
Right. And then you also have like this repetition of history, oh, the immigrants. You're like, this country is a country of immigrants. Like, these are people. This is one of the reasons why the United States is able to sustain such a high rate of productivity, is because we have no shortage. For most labor, there's not many shortages. Right now there is a labor shortage, but we're easily able to address these things with immigration. Like, so when they're talking about immigration, also, how is an illegal immigrant going to vote for anybody?
Yeah, like I was saying before, an illegal immigrant by definition cannot vote for anyone.
Yeah, so here's what that's something I don't get. Are they talking about like the kids from the illegal immigrants? Are they saying the kids from the illegal immigrants are not going to assimilate the culture? Like, is that what we're talking about? Like, I've known, because I've grown up in a Hispanic area when I was young, and I know Republicans and Democrats who are sons and daughters of immigrants. It doesn't mean like automatically, since they're a son or daughter of immigrants, that they're going to vote blue. It's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure. And that's part of the great replacement theory, that all these immigrants are coming in and they're going to replace all the white people and destroy our culture. But why
do they care about the replacement of white people?
Yeah, well, that's an important question.
What's the motivation? Like, what's the motivation for that? If there were a bunch of black people that they can import that were going to vote Republican, like, would we have the same rhetoric? I don't know.
I kind of doubt it in terms of people like Tucker Carlson. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, they're definitely painting particular people as undesirable. And I think this does translate into relations between immigrants and the American populace. Like, you've seen so many videos of Karens yelling at some Hispanic person or whatever, go back to your country.
Yeah.
I think these type of sentiments do carry over there. It's not like these things are are separate from each other. They're all connected.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think.
And also, in terms of immigration and the race of immigrants, this is reminding me too of when we talked about Thaddeus Russell's book, A Renegade History of the United States, and how the concept of race changes and what qualifies as a white person or any other type of race of person has changed innumerable times throughout history, and that some of the first immigrants to America were Irish and Italians and Jews, and all three of them were literally referred to by the N-word at first because these immigrants are, they're lazy and they drink too much and they're taking people's jobs and that kind of stuff.
Right. And the reason why, if they're so concerned about how these people, these non-white people, are going to vote, why are they not courting their votes instead of trying to deny them from participating in our system?
Yeah.
It kind of speaks volumes that that's the tactic that they're going to pursue. If they're going to pursue the tactic of, cutting people off from the system instead of trying to create a party where we want to include everybody, then I wonder where that problem lies,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they just need to stop denying, at least be truthful about that particular intent. Like, hey, a lot of the rhetoric is about exclusion. So if it is so, then hey, that's our party. We're about exclusion. And this is an attack. This is part of that tactic to exclude those who we think are not going to vote Republican. And I don't think there's like this exclusion mentality among the left, at least in mainstream politics, because we have, people who are clearly like not left wing, who are Democrats, like like Joe Manchin and people like that. And I think there was like a recent race where a Democrat was running, and he was like pro-choice pro-life, even among everything that's going on with abortion. But you are not going to find. I don't think there are any pro-choice Republicans like that are in office that I can think of.
Yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find one.
Yeah, so, and I know personally, even Joe Biden, like in his own personal life, is pro-life.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Because he's a Catholic.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah, he's
it's a bit interesting that
Joe Biden would have been referred to as literally the N-word if he were one of the first immigrants to America because he's Irish.
Right. So it's just funny that I think it's just interesting and funny. And mainly about the tactics that the right is using. It's like, okay, so we have these influx of people. Of course, they're going to be afraid because they're not going to court them to their party.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't they start trying to court these demographics? Maybe they won't have to exclude them. Yeah.
Maybe they'll have to do that at some point.
Sounds like they will need to. Like, it sounds like as the party becomes more exclusive, they're just going to have a smaller and smaller voting base, which is why now it seems like they're diving really deep into the culture war.
Yeah, that seems to be most of what they talk about, like we were talking about with Tucker Carlson.
Well, they kind of have to, because in a lot of points, they're kind of losing the policy debate.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that the Republican Party is dying, but they're increasingly having to fight hard on these wedge issues and do like the own the libs type of deal in order to stay relevant. Like they're not
Yeah.
even relevant in policy debates anymore. And it's funny because like the policy debates, they're like very unpopular. Like corporate Republican like stances on a lot of policy is not like what the majority wants. So that's kind of why they stay away from that stuff and
Yeah.
exclusively talk about like culture war and stuff, because that's all they got now. It's kind of nuts.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
Down to is just frequency. If we were seeing a large number of, woolly-headed, I don't mean woolly in terms of hair, but crazy, left-wing people, shooting up places because they've been watching Rachel Maddow, I think people would start saying that MSNBC has some blood on its hands. But instead, that's the only such incident that most of us can think of. I've often wondered why that sort of thing didn't happen more.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Also, that was reminding me too that, right-wingers tend to be much more likely to be pro-gun, and left-wingers tend to be much more likely to be anti-gun. So it would make sense that it would kind of make sense that mass shooters would be more likely to be right-wing because they're more likely to have guns.
Yeah, it's really weird because there's a weird history that always gets neglected. Because in the 70s, and I'm trying to get a hold of this book, and I have yet to get a hold of it. I think I'm going to have to actually go and see if it's on Audible. But there is this book that kind of covers the history of left-wing terrorism and stuff like that in the United States. And there was a lot of left-wing like terrorism in the 70s. We're talking about like bombings and terrorist groups like the Weathermen and stuff like that were clearly like left-wing. You don't really see that now for the most part. Because I'm trying to think of the 70s. And if we're talking about the 70s, culturally, I'm not sure where America was at as being more conservative or at least less conservative. I know the late 60s was kind of like a cultural turning point when it comes to that. Mm-hmm. But I do know in the 70s, there were a lot of domestic terrorism coming from the left wing. I know that's like really rare these days, but it was pretty prominent in the 70s.
Okay.
So it's not like left wingers are not capable of violence. They have been in the past.
Yeah, so for sure.
It just depends on whether they think they're being heard or not. So I seem to feel like the right winger feels more that they aren't being heard in our current media environment.
Right.
Maybe
that
why
makes sense.
You see kind of these violent outbursts, which is weird because a lot of these things, like if there's definitely outlets for these people to talk and discuss things. But if we're talking about mainstream culture, movies, just like mainstream corporate culture seems to be more left.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there has been more of a cultural shift in that way, which is maybe one of the reasons why the right wingers are more likely to talk about the culture war incessantly today too. And yeah, that's a good point. There has been a history of left-wing terrorism in the US, and also like even though there have been hardly any left-wing mass shooters in recent years, there still have been like those riots after the murder of George Floyd last summer, where a lot of them were peaceful and some of them really did get violent and start rioting and that sort of shit. So there is there is violence on the left too.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like riots are its own separate category, you know. It's kind of just something that gets out of hand. Like we definitely have, and it's almost similar. Like, okay, you could always point to Charlottesville and some of the other riots and stuff with the Proud Boys in Portland and stuff like that. But yeah, rioting seems to be what happens when you know, people use violence, that's when they feel like they're not being heard. Like it's kind of like an
Mhm.
extreme version. And I'm not saying that's the right way to go about it, but
Of
we
course.
see this in on the right too. Like the right will lash out with violence when they don't feel like they're being heard.
Like
Same thing with
January 6th
Democrats.
last year.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, you know, and it's funny because I know there are a lot of like you go online, and I remember during a lot of these like summer riots with the BLM, you hear like these criticisms like, why aren't these people at work? You know, blah 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 blah. And it's funny because you have this riot on January the 6th, and those like criticisms from the right are nowhere to be seen.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And some of these people that were at this political rally were like independently wealthy, you know.
Yeah,
A lot
yeah.
of people
Well,
who flew in from out of state. You know, you
yeah,
even had
then
politicians there.
and there was at least one woman who flew in on a private jet, right?
Right. Like Jesus.
Yeah. All right, let's get back into this here.
I don't want to put out any kind of model for it, but wouldn't you expect there would be more young black men pulling things like that? But luckily they don't. And instead, I think it would be safe to say that it's usually from the right. It's usually people who have been watching Tucker Carlson or reading the equivalent who pull these sorts of things, the manifestos that you find online, et cetera. So I think that's why nobody said anything about Rachel Maddow. If that happened 6 times in a year, people would start talking about how Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow need to quiet down. But there seems
Yeah.
to be a right-wing problem here. But God, this is delicate. I want to ask you something.
Yeah.
Did you read the Times' piece on Mr. Carlson a couple weeks ago? And
I heard about it and I read part of it. I'm not sure I read every word of it. It was very long and extensive.
no, nobody read every word. The Times was very thorough because they had to be. They had to get it all in. But yeah, it was not designed to be read. But we all saw that. And how do you and I differed after the racial reckoning. And we had a whole conversation about this in terms of who we would appear with. You appeared with him.
I did.
As in traveling to that place where he lives, et cetera. What is your feeling about that? And I don't mean that in a confrontational way, but based on the fact that his kind of ideology, and there's no evidence that the Buffalo Kid had been watching Tucker Carlson in particular, but it's the same ideology. All of this is coming from.
I mean, quite the contrary. Excuse me for interrupting. The Buffalo Killer despised Fox News along with a long list of other elements of American culture and politics whom he despised. He's way out there.
He's a contrary lunatic.
See, I didn't realize that until I heard him say that on there, because I thought that I had heard, I forget who I heard claim this, but I think I heard someone say that he cited Tucker Carlson specifically as an inspiration in his manifesto, but I haven't read his manifesto, so that's interesting.
There are very few inspirations in his manifesto. One of them is the Christchurch shooter is one of his inspirations. But as far as like Fox News goes, or anything goes, you can hate elements of something but still agree on certain points. I don't think his hatred of Fox News gets him out of the woods when it comes to the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah, because like John was saying there, he was very much, Tucker Carlson was pushing the Great Replacement theory, and it was that sort of rhetoric. That was the exact sort of same thing that inspired him.
Yeah, and then Tucker Carlson is straight up lying in his response to that, because he is trying to paint the guy. I actually read the manifesto. I didn't read the whole thing, but the points that he makes are clearly like right wing. Like the replacement as a racial issue, that's definitely right wing. And you'll hear like white supremacists say, "Oh yeah, they're fine as long as they stay in their own country. I just don't want them over here." I was like, yeah, that still doesn't mean that. Hey, that doesn't abscond their racism. Just because if you don't want to intermix with them or have anything to do with them, then that's just another facet of that racism.
Yeah, well, like segregationism is kind of inherently racist if you're doing it because of a person's race.
Right. So yeah, I looked over the guy's manifesto. I guess you can not agree with, like, for instance, like David Pakman doesn't identify himself as a Democrat, but he's clearly left wing, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to identify with the Republican Party in order to be not identified as right wing. The views he espoused in that manifesto are clearly right wing. He calls himself a neo-Nazi. He calls himself a white supremacist.
Okay.
I think he has some populist views in there, but you and I know that populist views don't necessarily have a left wing or right wing foundation. And a lot of times I've also heard that populism is more about the rhetoric that's used versus the policy.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense because, people referred to Trump as a populist, even though in terms of his policies, he was governing as a standard Republican.
Yeah, because a populist is more about talking about class divisions and pitting the working classes versus the elites. Like, you can do that in the context of right-wing rhetoric, or you could do it in the context of left-wing rhetoric. Because clearly Bernie was a populist. Clearly early versions of Donald Trump in his rhetoric were populist.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not really a left or right thing. He definitely had populist views, but the guy was clearly supporting a lot of right-wing type of policies. Like immigration, that's clearly a right-wing thing. So to say that this guy was not, like Tucker Carlson was saying, oh yeah, it's not clear that it was left wing or right wing. It's like the damn issue that he came out and killed people over was a right wing issue.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of ridiculous to kind of deny that.
Yeah, for sure. All right.
Lunatic. But
anyway,
how do you feel about, you were on a show with Carlson and he is promoting this great replacement idea. Where do you fit in on
well,
that?
I don't promote the quote unquote great replacement idea, which by the way is an imputation of motive to the Democratic Party comparable to the imputation of motive to the Republican Party when they stand up in state legislatures and say, we want to make sure that we have ID for people before we allow them to cast the ballot. The motive that's been imputed in that case is they want to keep Black people from voting. The motive that's imputed in this case is you've got an open border. Minorities are coming across the border in numbers, in large numbers. You're hoping to change the electoral outcomes in the future because you're bringing these people in. You're importing people who you think are going to vote for you. Now, there's an argument about voter ID that you could have quite independent of motive. How do we do elections? And there can be disputes about that, and people can be on different sides of that, and they don't have to be a racist to want ballot security. And there's an argument about how do you deal with immigration? Should you be strict and have people stay in Mexico and you work very hard to build a wall on the country's border to make sure that they don't come in? Or should you let them in with generous kind of amnesty-like attitude toward the country being a safe haven for people who are seeking a better life? And besides, we're probably largely responsible, either indirectly through climate change or directly through our support for bad governments in Central America over the years.
In terms of voter ID, I think that's interesting because Canada is seen by a lot of Americans as being more left-wing in general, but I never see any Canadian left-wingers talk about how voter ID is racist. People just accept you should have ID if you're going to vote. I've worked in elections before, and you can't vote unless you have like a driver's license or some other kind of photo ID or like bank statements or bills or credit cards or something like that. And yeah, I mean, since Black people are more disproportionately more likely to be poor, they're more likely to be less likely able to afford to pay for an ID and less likely able to get time off work to be able to go and get one and that sort of thing. That's true. But again, like, how do you still have to be able to prove your identity in some way to be able to prove that it's you who is voting.
True. There are multiple ways to prove that, because I think one of the problems is like there's an older generation who, for instance, there were a lot of babies that weren't born in hospitals, right? And when you're not born in hospitals, you typically don't have, social security numbers and stuff like that. And sometimes it can be harder for those people to vote, of course. I don't have a huge problem with the voter ID requirement. That isn't the voter ID seems to be like the big thing that people bring up, but there are also a number of measures included within that usually when people make voter ID laws, it's not just voter IDs that they try to eliminate. As you know how when people make laws and things, they try to group a bunch of shit into an act and pass it that way, right? So they might include restricting something like early voting, or also include restricting mail-in ballots. They usually try to lump all of those things into like their voter ID acts. But usually they head it up as voter ID because voter ID seems like completely reasonable. I think it would be, if you're going to vote in person, it would be completely reasonable to have an ID, to show an ID. But yeah, if they're concerned about illegal immigrants participating in elections, that is like the most ridiculous thing I can even think of.
Yeah.
Why would an illegal immigrant even do that?
That's a huge unnecessary risk, right?
Yeah, exactly. It makes no sense for an illegal immigrant to try to vote at all. They're basically trying to remain invisible to the government. It just does not make sense. And I don't think your average illegal immigrant who's basically crossing over from Mexico is paying too much attention to cable news. Like it's pretty clear that no matter who's the president, you see people lining up at the border. I know they thought that, because Biden's here, we're going to get in easier. There were still people being held in camps, so that didn't change much. Just because it's not Donald Trump doesn't mean a lot of shit changes. You know what I mean?
And Kamala said, "Immigrants do not come here. Do not come."
Basically. So yeah, I think voter ID is completely reasonable, but one of the things that we're kind of lacking here in the United States is, I don't know, like when it comes to voting days, do you guys typically give special compensation to workers? Do you have like lots of different places where people can vote? How does it work over there in Canada? Like on a voting day, is that like a national holiday? How does it work out over there?
No, I mean, I guess it's probably pretty similar to the way it is in the U.S. You don't get time off work, and it's not a holiday or anything like that. But you can anyone on election day. They're always I don't know, like at least a few different places in each neighborhood where you can go to vote, and they're open for like 12 hours, and anyone who wants to can register for advanced voting too.
Mm-hmm.
So it basically just works that way.
Yeah, because I don't understand. I live in a pretty big city. I think my county, Fairfax County, it's like 3 million. And every time that I voted here, it's taken no longer than 20 minutes.
Right.
I don't understand how some people have to wait in line for hours and hours just to vote.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was just thinking about that too. I mean, I can only recall two times I voted when I had to wait in a long line. Usually I hardly have to wait at all, if at all, and it's a very quick process. And that's even that's much more substantial where there's a way bigger population where you are, because the population is more like 100,000 here.
Yeah, because mine is 1.1 million in my county. The city I live in is pretty big. But yeah, there's definitely hurdles. It's harder for working people to vote in our country, and I guess disproportionately, like those types of people, it's harder for them to vote. It's harder to get transportation to vote, and then when you do vote, you gotta wait in like ridiculously long lines.
Yeah.
So, there are some places in our country where it's not easy to vote.
Yeah.
So I think it's ease of access to voting should be equal. And you'll require an ID. I think most people have identification.
Yeah.
I can't think of how do you get a bank account? Well, I guess there are some people that don't have bank accounts, but
yeah.
Most of the people who are concerned with that type of stuff, I'm guessing, aren't voting most of the time.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, it's like politics is kind of not something people are struggling. When you're struggling so hard that you don't even have a bank account, I think politics is usually the last thing on their minds.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know. I don't know how these voter ID laws on paper actually affect turnout. I'm sure there's some small effect. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah,
but man, I think voting days should be national holidays, in my opinion. I know one of my jobs gives me compensation for national elections.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah,
if
I
I
think
take off, I get paid for that if it's an election day.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, it would make sense for to me for either something like that to happen or for people to be allowed to get paid time off work or something like that if they need it, like you were saying.
Yeah, because in your country, do you have bylaw, like when it comes to labor laws in your country, are employers required to give like vacation time?
Only if you're not if you're a part-time employee. If you're a full-time employee anywhere, I think so, yeah.
See? I don't have that. I'm a
Oh,
full-time
okay.
employee and I don't have unpaid vacations.
Right.
I don't have paid vacations.
I think it's like 2 weeks a year, so it's nothing crazy like in some Icelandic countries. But yeah, that's one way that you guys in America are kind of lacking, especially like similarly to in your healthcare system and how you don't get maternity leave either.
Right. So there's no laws that are in place that guarantee those rights.
Okay.
So I can totally work in a full-time capacity and not have the right to maternity leave or paid vacation.
That's not good.
Well, that's how stuff is here, man. So
Yep.
I think that also contributes to like the lack of turnout. I know the last election was had historic turnout.
Right.
And I find that kind of hilarious because I know the turnout was mainly due to Donald Trump himself.
Yeah.
It's like, do you love Trump or do you hate Trump? I don't think people really cared too much about enthusiastically voting for Joe Biden.
Yeah.
It was people enthusiastically voting to get Trump out of office. Like nobody fucking gave a shit about Biden. You don't see it on social media at all. I don't see it anywhere. Maybe it's because I'm just don't run in those circles, but I don't see any like pro Biden anything anywhere.
Yeah. The only pro Biden people I see are other Democratic politicians.
Yeah, they're the only ones like singing the virtues of Biden. Like nobody does. You still, I don't know. Even the Trump stuff has died off a bit.
Yeah,
but
sure.
Even during the election, like I didn't see. It's not like Bernie Sanders where you saw a lot of people like really enthusiastic about his campaign. I couldn't find anybody that was enthusiastic about Biden at all.
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, that was a pretty big tangent there.
Yeah, no problem. All right.
Years for the fact that they're coming in the first place. There's real arguments about the border. There's independent of the motives of the people making the argument. I'm sorry to go on so long, but I have to give that preamble to say I went on Tucker Carlson because I wanted to speak to his audience. I have a message. I wanted the largest possible range of people to hear the message that I have. Tucker likes my message. He likes the fact that I'm telling Black people to stand up with their shoulders back. He likes the fact that I'm saying racism is one thing, self-determination for Black people is another. If we want true equality in the 21st century, we Black people need to get busy raising our kids and taking care of our own business. Nobody is coming to save us and so forth and so on. I wanted to get my message out to his audience. That did not mean by going on Tucker Carlson that I endorsed everything he says, but I think Tucker Carlson is a very effective voice for conservative ideas in
I think we started off around here and I accidentally went back, but oh well.
The political discussion of the country. And no, I don't think, despite the Karine Jean-Pierre, this is the new press secretary. She has been heard on MSNBC for years calling Tucker Carlson a racist. I don't think he's a racist. I think he's a conservative. I don't think I was being a part of a right-wing cabal that wants to go out and kill black people by going on the show. If I thought that, I would have had nothing whatsoever to do with him. He is not, I don't know who you want to pick, Jared Taylor or somebody like that, an open white supremacist. Tucker is a very effective conservative. He's the Rachel Maddow of the right. He puts on a show every night with an opening monologue, oftentimes that in my
we did go. Did we go? Maybe I'll go forward.
My opinion is spot on.
I'm comfortable in this era of our technology and our social media with when someone like him goes from being an intelligent conservative, which is what he is at heart, to being an entertainer and keeping the numbers up, especially from his side of the aisle, because
I don't think he's that intelligent.
Because what he's doing, and I'm going to sound like someone else in general, but he's being Father Coughlin. And notice I'm not saying Hitler, but he's being this kind of person who stirs up actual racism, bigotry, prejudice. For example, the Great Replacement idea has him claiming that these liberals want these people to come in and swamp the Andy Hardy, Wonder Bread, real Americans. And of course, no one wants that. As you're getting at, this is imputing some sort of agency motive, just like saying that voter ID laws are all about not liking black people as opposed to pragmatism. There's nobody who wants to swamp Wonder Bread Americans. And so, yes, you might have questions about immigration law at this point, although sometimes I do wonder why a lot of these people are talking about it as if the whole situation hasn't changed vastly from what it was, say, 10 years ago. But that's another issue. But Carlson, in keeping people entertained, and I imagine part of this is having to have something to say every night, is saying the sorts of things which 9 out of 10 listeners will hear and start thinking of this horde of dirty Latinos. That's the implication of it. Of course, he doesn't put it that way, white, but he's making people not like, and maybe not every Latino, but he's making people dislike a crowd of folks. And he's too smart to not feel some sense of remorse, I would think, in doing that. And it ends up being this whole world where people say, to an extent, we're entertainers as opposed to scholars. But when you're entertaining about that, aren't you, and this is separate from you having appeared on the show, but doesn't that revolt you somewhat, what someone like him is doing? And I knew him somewhat 20 years ago. I've seen his evolution. I just feel that it's irresponsible to talk that way about these things. God, I sound like James Clyburn all of a sudden, but he's stirring actual...
That's a good point.
...bigotry up, you know?
Well, no, I don't agree with you.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like we kind of talked about that before. He's with his rhetoric about the great replacement theory and so on. And trying to be entertaining about this sort of thing. He's being really outraged about it, and you can understand why people would feel right-wing people like that would feel that their voice is not heard. So they have to do something desperate. They have to do something violent because they have no other choice, because they're trying to destroy our culture and all that kind of shit, right?
Well, I think that fomenting outrage is okay if the target is right. Like fomenting outrage about, hey, the government is wasting money about this. Or fomenting outrage saying, oh, this corporation is not paying taxes. But when you foment outrage about a group of people, that's when I think it becomes a little bit unacceptable.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Like you're fomenting outrage about immigrants, these poor people who are trying to escape their countries to find a better life, who likely would become assets. You know, the interesting thing about immigrants is like they're not lazy.
Yeah, they tend to work really fucking hard.
Yeah, so we're getting some hard ass workers here. We're getting some hustlers. Every immigrant, like I live next to an apartment complex, and there's a lot of successful immigrants. They're all hustlers. Like I feel like I am lazy compared to all these people.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
we got immigrants from Ethiopia, and immigrants from Ghana, like African countries, immigrants from Eastern Europe, and where I live, immigrants from South Korea, and they're all hustlers, man. They're not sitting around waiting on government assistance. They're like, oh, I'm sending this back to my country and making like a 500% profit. And yeah, these people are going to be assets to society. Like, look what they're willing to do to get their asses over here to the United States. Like,
Mhm.
they're willing
Yeah, exactly.
to get through some pretty heinous shit to get over
They
here.
should,
So,
like, that's why some of them tend to be conservative, and why, like, logically speaking, it would make sense for conservatives to admire their politics and their temperaments in some ways. Like, the value of hard work is very important, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work really hard, and you can improve your life, that sort of thing.
yeah, so I don't know what the big deal is about these people who are obviously hardworking and want a better life. Hey, if I was a Republican, I would want to get these people to vote Republican. I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to just kind of dismiss them outright. These are
Yeah.
the kind of people that are really hard workers. They're not going to be lazy. I know
Mhm.
that's one of the things Republicans are always talking about, lazy people on welfare.
Yeah.
Immigrants are hustlers. Like every illegal immigrant that I knew had some type of hustle going on. Like
Right.
they weren't just sitting around doing nothing. They were always busy and
Working
hustling.
3 jobs.
Right. 3 jobs under the table, and they're not going to have any retirement money because they can't. They don't have a 401k. They don't have Social Security. So,
Or healthcare.
so those families even though they're over here, hey, it's tough for them, but back in their home countries, it'd be even tougher for them.
Yeah.
So I kind of respect the immigrant hustle, because most immigrants are hustlers. I can't say the same for like natives. Like, and interesting enough, I think there is a point when you come to specific communities that have generations of blight and things like that, where you see like this kind of generational hopelessness imbued into certain regions and cultures in the US. Like I get that.
Yeah.
But when someone's a new and an immigrant, just coming over here is an upgrade from where they were. So they're already seeing improvement in their lives. It's different from when you're born poor and you're already in America, like the richest country in the world. It's not like he can move to some other country outside of America and get a better life. It would be, you're already at the place, you know what I mean? So it's different if you're brought up and you don't have that kind of immigrant hustler mindset.
Yeah.
But anyway, what Glenn Loury, I don't know. I agree with McWhorter here. I do think that the great replacement rhetoric is a bit malicious, and it's fomenting outrage about a particular group of people based off of a circumstance that it's not a political circumstance.
Yeah.
They're not moving over here because of politics. I get it when you have conservatives that are, oh, Black Lives Matter. It's about a political idea that they disagree with. There's no political idea with these immigrants. They're just trying to get a better life and trying to improve their material situation.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and then when you you demonize them for simply being themselves, that's bad. Like, it's the same thing for demonizing black people or whoever for simply being themselves.
It's the same thing as Robin DiAngelo demonizing white people for being white.
Right. Same thing. Same exact thing.
Yeah. Right.
You about that. I think there's no doubt that some of what you said is true. That is to say, there are some people who tune into his program and become, angrier and more racist from having listened to his very effective diatribes that he starts off with. Look what the Dems are doing now. Look what the Dems are doing now. I don't doubt that that's true. Just as if a person turns to MSNBC and hears Al Sharpton or
Chris Hayes or Rachel Maddow
or the black woman who's took Joy Reid, doesn't feel reinforced in their views with which you and I would disagree about the ubiquitous and unrelenting knee on the neck of Black Americans, so forth and so on. I'll say this. The replacement theory, such as you described it, white bread is going to be overtaken by, the taco. Is racist.
Well, it already is, like, culturally.
But the idea promulgated by Democrats that the country is becoming...
Can you pause real quick? Like, that's kind of already the case here in the U.S. because at one point, like, ketchup was the most popular condiment, and that got taken over by salsa.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, tacos are good.
Yeah, tacos are excellent.
Yeah.
Becoming a minority country, that white Americans are dwindling in number, and by the year 2050 will be an absolute minority. The president of the United States, Joseph Biden himself, has been heard to say this. The idea that black people...
this is the whole thing where he doesn't say this, but some conservatives say, oh, see, that means that Democrats are the one promoting great replacement theory. And I saw a video, for example, about how I think it was Ben Shapiro who was saying that the great replacement theory literally comes from the left, which is just ridiculous. Oh wait, no, it was a Vosh video where he was criticizing Steven Crowder's position about that. Yeah.
So they're trying to say that it was invented by the left?
Yeah. Even though their point is not that this is a bad thing and we need to stop it. It's that there are going to be demographic changes due to immigration. They're not saying they're going to vote for us, so we should promote this. And like we were saying too, Democrats are not open borders or anything like that. And Biden and Harris are not particularly pro-immigration politicians.
Right. I think it's like I think it's more of an objective fact on the left. It's like, okay, we're kind of saying that the demographic changes are happening. I don't know if I haven't really heard them say if this is a good or bad thing. I think they just kind of acknowledge that it's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
But on the right, it's like, oh no, the white people are going to become minorities. What's going to happen? And if that is the fear mongering going on, that's definitely racist fear mongering. So.
Yeah, exactly.
People should join hands with brown people as underrepresented minorities and vote Democrats into office all around the country. And the crowing that Texas is going to become a purple state and it's going to become a blue state because the demographics of Texas are going to change. This is not something that Tucker Carlson imagined or made up. This is actually what Democrats are saying about their strategy for how to win elections. Okay, so if a person observes that the Democrats are...
Is he saying that Democrats are promoting this theory that we want to bring in immigrants so they'll vote for us?
I guess that's what he's trying to say. But
I haven't heard. I haven't seen Democrats promoting that.
Yeah, me neither.
Maybe he'll name some people.
Well, I know it's probably a political strategy, though, to try to get immigrants to vote for Democrats. But
If they're legal immigrants, I can see how that would make sense. Yeah, not with the illegal ones, obviously.
Yeah, I don't know. So I have no idea if we're talking about. Are they talking about purely like illegal immigration? Is that what they're saying?
If so, I don't see how that would make sense.
Yeah,
because like we were talking about, like illegal immigrants aren't going to vote for people.
Yeah, there's no open borders.
Yeah.
So, and these illegal immigrants aren't voting for anybody.
Yeah, of course.
Playing race cards left and right. For example, gerrymandering congressional districts to make sure that enough minorities are inside the line to get a minority official elected to office. That's a part of the larger political environment that we live in. Encouraging people. What happened at the Democratic candidates debate in 2020 when the moderator asked people, raise your hands if you would extend social benefits to unauthorized or undocumented immigrants, and all of them, or almost all of them, raised their hands and said yes. What's that about? Is that about social policy? We want to make sure that everybody in our country is taken care of, or is it about electoral appeal along racial and ethnic lines to part of the constituency that you hope will vote for you because you are waving this flag of racial solidarity?
But why the they stuff?
Why the they stuff? Also, like, to me, that sort of thing just seems like virtue signaling on the part of Democrats. Like, do they actually give a shit about these immigrants? I kind of doubt that they do.
Yeah, until it affects certain things. Like, I know, I think I saw this one video about the hypocrisy of liberals, and it was largely true. And they were talking about, oh yeah, providing low income housing for those who, don't have the opportunities to pay, but no middle class person, like liberal, wanted anybody to build a housing complex for lower income people in their neighborhood.
Right.
So they'll say this stuff, but it'll be like, not my neighborhood, maybe someone else's neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's like that hypocrisy going on the left as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Why does it have to? Where do we get the idea that this replacement? Yeah. Why is it bad? Why is it that there are they coming over the hill? Why is it painted that way?
Yeah,
well, that is problematic. I mean, that is inviting a reaction from the audience that is not one that I could possibly endorse, in which you say there's a conspiracy of one sort or another. I mean, the they is the Democrat. I mean, in as I understand Tucker's argument, the Democratic Party wants to win elections, and that's why they are unconcerned about unauthorized immigrants entering the country, because they think one day those immigrants will be grandfathered into the electorate and will be voting for Democrats instead of for Republicans. Now, you could say that without any reference to the race of the people involved. And that the they in this question, in this point of view, is the political Democrats who are changing the character, or quote unquote, changing the character of our country in order to feather their electoral nest.
You know what?
I mean, how's this any different than they don't want Black people to vote, Stacey Abrams or whatever, and that's why we need to have a federal John Lewis law to make sure that they, in this case, Republican racists, don't. I mean, I don't understand how the third person.
Because there are elements in the brew here that mean that stirring somebody up about this theyness has a way of leading to heinous events more than stirring somebody up about voter ID laws. That doesn't seem to make anybody pick up a gun. And what I don't like about this partly is just, I sense a kind of a laziness on both sides. You and I both, the Charles Blow kind of person who just sees racism everywhere and just writes the same column over and over. I must admit that I think of that and I think that's not trying hard enough. Boy, that's imperious of me to say, but it's what I feel. If you have a pulpit, if you only see that one thing and you are a person with 2 eyes and 2 ears and an education and a soul, is that all? I get impatient with that. And with this Carlsonian business, and this is a lot of the people at Fox, I find it's lazy. And I hate to say this because I really don't believe in the sellout, but is it really that?
Yeah, great replacement theory is Carlsonian.
It makes a lot of money. I mean, for example, you and I could do something. I
don't think that's it. By the way, excuse me for interrupting. I don't think it's purely grifterism. I think it's trying to give voice to something that's not said anyplace else in American politics.
You and I could do very well if instead of trying to think, which I think both of us try to do, we basically, I could write a column twice a week. I could make it a kind of a watchdog thing. Some professor they're trying to fire, some school that's being turned upside down, some black person writes a bad book. I could do that every time. Frankly, it would be easy. And you
become the black person who denounces the other black person. You get paid very well.
Mm-hmm. We could go around doing that. We could do a show together where basically we traveled around saying terrible things about people like Charles Blow on stage, and we could get rich doing that. There are people who would want to hear it, and a lot of them are not Republicans. Neither one of us would do that. It would be too easy. I wouldn't want to die having done that, even though it would make more money. Don't you want to be the best that you can be? I don't think that's the best that Tucker Carlson can be. It just seems like he's making people jump, and he notices that it works, and he gets a lot of love mail for it, and it keeps the ratings up, and maybe it does pad his nest somewhat. I don't know. I don't know him, but
he's doing well. There's not any doubt about that. He's the highest rated cable news guy out there, and his star has risen substantially in the last few years. I mean, where Sean Hannity's has gone into somewhat of a decline, and Bill O'Reilly no longer is on the air for.
I assume he has a podcast or something, but yeah,
he probably does. I don't. I think Tucker thinks. So he's strident. I mean, maybe one way reducing the thing to a word is he's strident. He's demagogic to a certain extent. You said Father Coughlin. I say Coughlin. Is that wrong to say? You say Coughlin?
I think I heard somebody say it that way recently. I used to think Coughlin too, but
who was a radio personality back in the 30s when Hitler's rise to power and whatnot, and is kind of fomenting of fascism and fascistic sentiments. And I'm reluctant to. I see why people would say that about Tucker. I think that's a bad rap. I think he thinks he's saving the country. I think he thinks he's taking up issues that no one else will take up. Let me give an example. Summer of 2020, George Floyd riots. Yes, there were protests. There were also riots. Large numbers of black people running through American cities, burning shit down, attacking people, killing each other, throwing projectiles. Not only black people, obviously not only black people were involved in these protests, but you could turn on Tucker Carlson on a given night and you could see images of this thing going down that undoubtedly fueled a lot of anti-black sentiment out there in the country, but that were also accurate accounts of what was going on. In Chicago, the magnificent mile of North Michigan Avenue, which used to be one after another high-end shopping experience, boutiques and whatever.
What?
I think an accurate account includes telling all sides of the story. Like if he's just showing like, oh, the rioters are doing this and this and that, but not showing that the rioters are much smaller percentage of the protesters are trying to lump in that as being the protest about being all about that. I think that's not being accurate.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's just as bad as some of the lefty news networks like MSNBC and CNN apparently were claiming that there was no violence and there were no riots or anything like that, even though that's like was impossible to deny. That's
Yeah, I watched some CNN during that, and they weren't denying that there were riots going on.
Oh,
Like,
okay.
Yeah, Chris Cuomo
Was
was
MSNBC?
no longer. No, this was CNN that I was watching.
Okay.
But was like Chris Cuomo was like, yeah, there are riots here,
Okay.
and I do not condone any of this rioting. So it's not like they didn't recognize that it was happening.
Okay.
They definitely were, at least from what I saw, because I was trying to flip between both. I actually don't even pay attention to MSNBC at all.
Okay.
It's just too cringy for me to watch.
Okay.
Even Fox is cringy, but
Yeah.
I try to get to see what they're saying. But yeah, I don't think focusing on one particular thing and not trying to grab at least the whole situation, trying to pay credence to everything that's going on. You have to do that in order to provide an accurate picture. You know, cherry picking to me is not providing accuracy.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Has basically been decimated by the behavior of the sort that Tucker began to document in the summer of 2020, and which has carried forward. So is that not supposed to be reported on? If there's an understanding that the guy who drove that SUV into a crowd in Waukesha, Wisconsin, was motivated by anti-white racial animus. But there's a kind of blanket in terms of the respectable coverage of the event that de-emphasizes that aspect of it. And Tucker decides, well, I'm going to shout from the rooftops the fact that a black guy drove an SUV into dancing grannies and mowed them down. And do you know what? You can't hear a mumbling word about this at the New York Times, but do you know what? This is going on in our country and it's something that we should be concerned about. Is he a racist for breaking the otherwise uniformly adhered to taboo on that kind of reporting? The fact that his audience grows and grows tells me that people are hungry for that kind of information. Are they racist for resenting the manipulative?
Either people are hungry for that information, or he's a very good entertainer, as they were talking about too, about how much he's an entertainer, or it could be both.
Yeah, are they trying to say that the Waukesha, Christmas truck attack was racially motivated?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that.
Because if it was racially motivated, he would have been charged with a hate crime. And I don't think he was.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what the motivation was.
Control over Hunter Biden's laptop, media over how it is that we think about what's going on in Ukraine, over whether or not Trump was actually a Putin, et cetera. There's this partisan division in the way in which information is reported, which cries out for, and if Tucker Carlson didn't exist, somebody else would come along and fill that void for a voice that says, no, wait, don't just believe what they tell you at CNN and the Washington Post. Here's another angle on the story about what's happening in our country, et cetera. So that's kind of how I look at it. Without endorsing, I nevertheless accept as legitimate a platform in which that kind of thing is voiced. And I'm, without endorsing, willing to go on and speak my mind on such a platform because I want to appeal to the country, not just to the part of the country that already agrees with me.
That's fair.
It's the best defense I got, man. It may not be adequate. You can tell me.
No, I don't disagree with anything that you said. All of those things needed to be pointed out. And if you are in the media, you have to ballyhoo somewhat. He's not going to just sit there and say it neutrally. I understand the entertainment part to an extent. I guess we're narrowing it down to a particular problem I have with you can't help but hear him as saying these swarthy hordes are coming in who don't share our values.
Yeah.
They're going to take over. So yeah, I completely get that he's telling his audience,
Yeah, swarthy hordes. Beware of the swarthy hordes.
don't let these people, these libs, tell you that you're a racist. They're going to call you a racist every time you try to open your mouth. Yeah, I get that. That is something that they need to be told, because people from the left do overdo that charge in a grievous fashion, sure. But to go from that to the swarthy hordes coming over the hill, when you know that people have been saying things like that since the 1700s, and it never turns out to have any meaning. Tucker knows that. Benjamin Franklin was saying that about Germans, and I don't even need to give the other examples. It's dangerous.
Yeah, like the evil Irish and the evil Italians and the evil Jews, right?
Right.
And
I just found out
ends
some
up
more
being
information, by the way, about that attack. Apparently, the guy had a history of posting on social media advocating for violence against white people and Jews.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Mm.
So it was racially motivated.
Well, I don't know, because I'm not sure what the content. I'm not sure what the racial content of that parade was. Was it just all white people?
Okay.
So,
I don't know. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
A signature part of what he's doing. The things that you described are important. Yeah, the Waukesha incident, it's ridiculous how people made it seem like it was the car that did it and not the man, and we never heard anything about it after about a week. Yeah, that wasn't right. But the swarthy hordes, I can't get past it.
So let me try to change the conversation here a little bit, if I may, away from Tucker Carlson, the personality, to the question of is it good for the country that we don't have control of the border and that people come in the thousands and tens of thousands and ultimately in the millions without authorization? So here's an argument that I don't think is a swarthy horde argument. I am an American citizen. That's a very special endowment, which I have inherited in virtue of my birth. This is my country. There are 330 million or so of us. We should get to decide what the future of the composition of our polity is going to be through legitimate democratic deliberation. That's what we elect representatives for. That's the purpose of law.
What do you mean composition?
Well, what I mean is who comes into the country. That's something that we can legitimately decide about. If we don't have control of our border, this is an argument. I understand that it echoes people like Donald Trump because he ran for president and got elected for president in part on this kind of argument. And I'm inviting your response because I think something very important is at stake for the future of the country. If we don't have control and we simply allow anyone who has the resources to get themselves to the Mexican side of that border and wade across that river into the country, we will look up in 20 years, in 50 years, and find that we are a different country than we had been in ways over which we did not exert the legitimate discretion that is our inheritance as citizens of the country. And therefore, what's going on the border is something that we should all be upset about, and we should be intervening. If it's a wall, it's a wall. If it's enhanced border security forces, that's what it is. If it's sending people back to Mexico, if it's deporting, if it's changing the asylum process, that's what we should do. We need to get control of this issue. Now, I'm asking you, what's racist about that? And the reason I ask it is because I could see African Americans who are disproportionately exposed to perhaps the adverse consequences of uncontrolled immigration coming in, whether it's through the labor market or through competition for public resources or whatever it is, saying, well, wait a minute, it's my country too. And you guys who have just assimilated my historical argument, this is African Americans, I have a historical argument. It is my ancestors have been enslaved, and then their descendants have been denied equal citizenship, and there are legacy effects of that even into the present day. And I want a social compact that takes care of those concerns, the consequences of which are diluted by the admission of unrestricted people coming across the border, et cetera. I stumble here a little bit because I know that I'm flirting with, some of the unacceptably racist kind of language that other people are inclined to use. But what concerns me is that the
Beware of the swarthy hordes.
ability to deliberate for us over the legitimate question of what's going to be the composition of the polity is being washed away by all of this accusatory kind of commentary, which says, if I want there to be a border, I don't want any brown people to come into the country. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying we can stumble forward as a nation in terms of who are incorporated among us, or we can deliberate and decide as a nation as to who are incorporated among us. Other countries do that. For example, they have qualifications about immigration, which they regulate whom they're prepared to admit, grant visas to, and ultimately extend citizenship to, based upon the extent to which those people who are the beneficiaries of that largesse are thought to be adding positive value to the collective enterprise of the country. Is that really a racist stand to say that I want to exercise that kind of discretion over who comes into the United States of America?
Of
I have an
course,
interesting point here.
it's unideal.
Yep.
There seems to be like a focus on people crossing the border. The problem is that most illegal immigrants do not cross the border illegally.
They
The
come
vast-
in other ways.
Yeah, most illegal immigrants are overstayed visas.
Oh, okay.
So how come nobody's talking about the overstayed visa?
That's
In
a good
all of
point.
these conversations, it's always, illegal border crossing, illegal border crossing. It's like, yeah, what about the overstayed visas? You guys, you guys taking the same deal with these people too, or no?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I bet to be fair, I bet some conservatives bring up that point too. But you're right; it's never their focus. It's people crossing the border illegally. That's always their focus. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
but
most of them.
if they're concerned with illegal immigration, and most illegal immigrants are in the country because of overstayed visas, then overstayed visas should be the central tenet of their arguments.
They should. Yeah, you're right.
But it's not, because people who are on overstayed visas are mostly people who are not crossing the border, which are Mexicans.
Yeah. Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that's true.
There
That's
are
a good
definitely some Mexicans with overstayed visas, but when we're talking about overstayed visas, this is everybody that gets into the country from any country that's not like a border with us.
Right. Yeah, there could be a lot of white people who are overstaying their visas too.
Right. But that's not the argument.
Yeah.
The argument is, the border crossers. So they're lesser than the overstayed visas, but they're overwhelmingly not going to be ethnically white. So that's an interesting argument. It's like, why are they selecting these particular groups of people versus the group of people who actually have a larger amount of people who are overstaying their visas and are here illegally that way? It's interesting that they're not focusing on that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Ideal to have people wading in. Sure, you want control. But I sense a subtext in what you're saying that there's certain people who we would decide we don't want to come. And I know that you're not saying that what would decide that is there being Latinos. That's not remotely what you're saying. But who are the ones who would be turned away who get in otherwise? Or are you saying that it's just that there are too many, which seems to no longer actually be the case? What criteria are not being applied?
Well, in the first instance, you violated the law of the country by entering without authorization. We have a process here to vet your asylum claim. We call it asylum. It's asylum. It's not general openness to anybody who wants to come. You have to have a legitimate claim. We're prepared to vet it. And then we're going to set the rules about how we vet it. But the first order of business is orderly, legally authorized entry to the country. So who I don't want to come? Anybody who doesn't have my permission to come. Okay. Beyond that, if you were to ask me, and there are more people who want to come than there are, quote unquote, places for them to come, and we have to decide how many places we want to make available for people to come, I would say people who are going to come and be dependent on the rest of us for their support are less desirable than people who want to come and who are going to start businesses or bring skills or things of this kind. So I'm, for one,
and like you said, that's in your experience, but it describes most immigrants.
Right. Most immigrants are visa overstays.
Yeah.
So I think McWhorter's point about being afraid of the swarthy hordes is largely true.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
Me
who
too.
they're focusing their argument on. There's that particular group rather than the larger group, which is visa overstays.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
This is not asylum. I'm not talking about asylum now. I'm talking about discretionary admission of people who are not legitimately claiming to be seeking asylum, which claims will be vetted in our courts according to our rules. I'm talking about other people who want to come into the country, but are petitioning for permission to do so. And yeah, I don't see any reason why I can't distinguish amongst them based upon what it is I think they're going to add to the net social benefit of the rest of the society.
Now, don't you think that it would be more citizenly for certain highly influential media hosts to say something like this in perhaps punchier, more accessible language than to depict these people as swarthy hordes who are trying to push their way in, if they can just break down the dam and they're going to change the nature of our country because, and the implication is clear, they speak Spanish and they have different food, and there's always this overhanging sense that they don't really want to work.
Watch out for the swarthy hordes. They eat tacos.
Mm-hmm.
That there's something wrong with them, that they're not what we real Americans are. Is that necessary? Because that's not what you're saying.
No, that, of course, is not what I'm saying. They're speaking Spanish or having different food is completely irrelevant. Now, what did Donald Trump say when he came down the escalator? Mexico is not sending us our best. Different food is best. They're sending murderers and rapists and drug dealers.
Oh, shit. Sorry.
Uh-oh.
I started playing that in two different places by accident there.
Dealers,
Okay.
and I assume some are good people, something, words to that effect. That's not what I'm saying. I am not categorically imputing drug dealership or whatever. But if you turn to Fox News, you will see, amongst other things, a litany of reports about people who have entered the country, committed crimes, been deported, and then come back into the country by walking across the border and committed more crimes. That actually does happen. I don't want those people in my country. I'm not saying that they are all or even most or even a significant minority of the people who are coming across, but I'm saying there are such people and I don't want them in my country.
You know, that there's a little sideline on that, and I almost hate to say it, but it needs to be said. The good word now is that Trump called Mexicans rapists. That has always been a willful misinterpretation of what he said. He said they send us the rapists among them, and I think it's a reasonable assumption that he thinks that they're rapists among all nations and people. The idea that what he said is that to be Mexican is to be a rapist is an athletic interpretation of what he said, that people seem to almost enjoy lobbing around. I don't think anybody actually heard it that way. Or if they did, we need to listen to each other more closely, even when it means listening to Donald Trump. They're rapists. He didn't mean that all Mexicans are rapists. I always found that to be a lapse, but still. Yeah, I understand completely what you're saying. I don't know how many of these criminals have come in. I mean, is it static? Is it just the occasional tail? Or is it a significant percentage? I don't know. And yes, it's not right that the second you have anything to say about immigration except let them in, you're a bigot. That's the same sloppy reasoning that creates people thinking that Donald Trump stood there on that escalator and called Mexicans rapists. But still, I sense a lack of civic responsibility in the way some people talk about these things, where people like this Buffalo guy can hear. Again, he didn't happen to listen to Tucker Carlson in particular, but that whole way of discussing things, 4chan, etc. I don't know.
The swarthy hordes coming in to make people eat tacos is very Carlsonian.
Let's talk about something else. What else is on your mind these days?
Yeah, so we'll stop it there. We've been that's basically
the hordes.
The swarthy hordes want to come in and force you to eat tacos. Yeah.
Yeah,
all right,
I remember the hordes.
Yeah.
The horde narrative.
Yeah. That's
the caravan, remember that one?
Yeah. Yeah, I should call that the swarthy horde narrative from now on.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that's the section of that where they were discussing that. I thought that was really interesting, and I always think their discussions are interesting because they have similar views but slightly different views on some things, because Glenn Loury is conservative and John McWhorter is kind of more classical liberal-ish. So I thought their discussion and disagreements and agreements about that was really interesting. So yeah, I thought you would like going through that with me.
Yeah, and I think Glenn had some good points. Yeah, I wouldn't want like the repeat offender, like illegal immigrant, to keep showing up here and causing crimes.
Yeah,
that's for sure. I think there's definitely should be a focus on getting those particular people out of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Or
like people who overstay their visas, like they say, like you said.
Yeah, because there are people that overstay they get into the country on a work visa or a student visa or some type of visa, and they don't go back to their home countries. They just stay here, and that's also illegal immigration.
Yeah, and it's most of it, like you said.
Yeah, I guess they just only care about the poor people who can't afford to get a visa. Yeah, the ones that cross illegally, but not the ones who are actually here illegally. But they should care about all of them if that's the case.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for talking with me about this, man. I thought that was fun. I know a lot of the YouTubers we follow have been making tons of content about this. I thought about whether I should talk about it, and then last night I happened to watch this podcast, and I thought this is by far the best discussion about this and analysis of it that I've seen so far. And Glenn Loury and John McWhorter's discussions are very reliable for that. So yeah, thanks to everyone for watching. Like and subscribe and click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Last one I did was a re-upload of the chat that Dusty and I did on his channel called Woke Centrist, where we talked about the Joker movie. So check that out, and check out Dusty's channel, Woke Centrist, where tomorrow we will be talking about that movie with Michael Douglas in it called Falling Down, about a guy who kind of goes crazy, and it's kind of unintentionally comical with how much racism and how much ridiculousness there is in that movie. And hopefully next weekend, hopefully we can finally do that chat about taxi drivers. that'll be really fun to do. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And also check out my Patreon page. Link is in the description of the video as always. If you want to give me like $1, $5, $10, 100, 1,000 a month, that would be greatly appreciated. Of course, any amount is greatly appreciated. And yeah, thanks again, everyone, for watching. And anything else you want to say before we end it there, Dusty?
Just that I can't wait to discuss Falling Down tomorrow. Interesting cultural commentary and interesting. I know some of the comedy is intentional and some of it's definitely unintentional.
Yeah.
But I think Michael Douglas, his dad, he described this as the best role that Michael Douglas has ever played.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
he plays a villain in this movie.
Yeah, he does. Yeah,
they make
he
it
does
clear, though, at the end of the movie that he is a bad guy, unlike Taxi Driver.
Yeah. He says, "I'm the bad guy." Yeah, the Taxi Driver is a much darker ending.
Yeah, very ambiguous. Like, what? Interesting. But we'll talk about that when we get there.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so check out that chat tomorrow, everyone, on Dusty's channel, Woke Centrist. And thanks for watching again. And adios until next time.
Yeah, adios.